Thank you for those songs. Isn't it interesting that the index in the hymn book doesn't have a single song designated as truth? That was a fascinating statement that you made this morning, and I double-checked. I thought, no, that can't be. Surely there are songs that focus on truth, and not a single one there. And yet, how important is truth? Truth matters. Turn with me, if you will, to 1 Timothy chapter 3. We'll be looking at verses 15 and 16. 4 high school boys could not resist the temptation on one of those beautiful spring days to skip class in the morning. Each had a bad case of spring fever. And so about lunchtime, the 4 of them finally showed up at school after having just a luxurious morning. Told the teacher, sorry we're late, we had a flat tire, it took us a while to get it fixed and get here. She smiled and she said, that's okay, no problem. She said, you did miss a quiz this morning, so while the rest of the kids are at lunch, why don't you make up that quiz? And she smiled, and they thought, well, okay. She swallowed our excuse. So they sat down, got their pens and papers out, and she said, all right, question number 1. Still smiling. Which tire was flat? Truth matters. 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 15 and 16 says, but if I tarry long, that thou mayest know how thou oughtest to behave thyself in the house of God, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and ground of the truth. And without controversy, great is the mystery of godliness. God was manifest in the flesh, justified in the Spirit, seen of angels, preached unto the Gentiles, believed on in the world, received up into glory. So I appreciate our songs this morning focusing on Jesus Christ because He is truth. We saw that in John 14. Here, the mystery of godliness, that list in verse 16, all of those are referring to Jesus Christ. For it was Jesus Christ who was manifest in the flesh. It was Jesus Christ who was justified by the ministry of the Spirit. It was Jesus Christ who was seen here on earth by the angels. It was Jesus Christ who was preached unto the Gentiles. Aren't you glad that the gospel was preached to the Gentiles? We probably don't have very many Jews here tonight. So the gospel was preached to the Gentiles. And of course, Paul is writing to Timothy, who is in Ephesus. Ephesus had a small Jewish population, but the vast majority of the church at Ephesus, over which Timothy pastored, was a Gentile church, believed on in the world, and then, of course, received up into glory. The church is the pillar and the ground of the truth. Now, the context here is in the context of proper behavior. Paul said in verse 15, I want you to know how to behave. He's not talking here about making sure that the children don't run in the church or climb up on the pulpit or do those kinds of things. You know, we tell our children, now behave. He's talking about the behavior of the church in the world around them. He's talking about how the church is supposed to present itself to the unsaved world. This is not academic. This is not dealing with how we conduct ourselves inside of the 4 walls of our church, because the problem that Paul is addressing and the problem that Timothy was facing in Ephesus was that there were opponents who were perverting the truth, primarily Jewish opponents, who were perverting the truth of the gospel in Paul's day, and they were dragging down the testimony of the church. You know, we all know churches that have lost their testimony. And when people in the community talk about the church, they do so in derision because something significant happened in that church. It could be a moral issue. It could be a fight within the church that spilled out into the community. It could be a financial issue. As Roy mentioned this morning, I've been at Maranatha since its beginning. My wife and I came there as students, and with the exception of 1 year, we remained afterwards. Our first president was a wonderful man, a pioneer, had the vision that someone needs to start a work like this, but he wasn't very good at finances. He struggled on the financial side. And when our second president arrived, Maranatha was in financial difficulties. And I remember a story that Dr. Winiger told of one of his early days in Watertown. He was trying to get acquainted with some of the key people in town, and so there's a businessman that owned a fairly large company in town, owned a lot of property in town, a lot of rental property. And so he called him up, introduced himself, and said, "Can we do lunch?" So the man said, "Fine, I'll pick you up." So he drove to the campus, picked up the president. They went out for a nice lunch, had a good time, kind of got acquainted with each other, a little bit about their backgrounds. This man is Jewish. He brought Dr. Winiger, after about an hour, back to the campus. Just as Dr. Winiger was about to get out of the car, this man said, "Can I ask you one question?" And of course, they've been talking for an hour or more now. And Dr. Winiger said, "Sure, shoot." He said, "When are you going to pay your bills?" Well, that got Dr. Winiger's attention. And he said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "You have owed us money, my company money, for months." And he said, "The bills haven't been paid, and there's been no communication concerning those bills." And he said, "And I'm not alone." People talk. The community begins to hear things, and it can damage the testimony. Well, I tell you, Dr. Winiger walked into campus that day, and he figured out that afternoon, who did we owe money to and how much did we owe? And he worked very hard from that point on to bring Maranatha up to speed on its debt, wrote letters of apology, and set into place wheels of processes that we follow to this day with minor modifications to make sure that we are always in the black. Because testimony is important. So Paul was concerned. The conduct of church members, the conduct of the church as a body is essential to the proclamation of truth in a community. And so Paul says that the church, and he says it's not just the church, he says it's the church of the living God. Now, there were lots of religious institutions in Ephesus. There was only one church, but there were a lot of pagan temples. And so a person could go to a temple, a place of worship, just about any time he wanted to. But Paul emphasizes that these Christians in Ephesus were not going to a pagan temple where that god or goddess was a piece of stone or a piece of wood or a piece of brass that had been formed into an image. Paul was emphasizing the fact that these Christians in Ephesus were gathering together like we are tonight to worship the living God. It's interesting to look at the idolatry that we find in both the Old and the New Testament. My favorite story is Elijah up on the mountaintop. Those prophets of Baal. The things they did to try to get Baal's attention. I mean, they spent all day shouting, offering sacrifices, cutting themselves and offering their own blood as sacrifice to Baal, because he was a hunting god, so he kind of smells the blood and brings them to his attention. They just couldn't get Baal to respond. You can't get any pagan god to respond. They're just wood. They're just stone. One of the opportunities that I have as the dean of the seminary is to travel. And I've been overseas a number of times helping teach nationals primarily. In Burma, Myanmar, you can go to the place where they carve the Buddhas. And you'll see these blocks of stone. One of them was massive. I mean, it must have been 30 feet long and 10 feet high. And you see the master carver, I'm not sure what they call the guy, the architect. He's out there directing people. And you have these little, they look like kids, teenagers maybe, scrambling all over this Buddha, chipping away at the various areas and getting chunks of rock off of that Buddha to eventually form what he's going to be. But the cool thing is you can go across the street. And across the street, you can buy these little elephants and these little figurines that are made out of the marble that's been chipped away from the Buddha. And so you take home your little trinket, your little souvenir of the non-Buddha part of the rock. And you go to the temples where you see these Buddhas sitting, occasionally lying down. They worship, they burn candles, they do all kinds of things. But it's just a rock. We worship the living God. He said it is a church that belongs to this living God. Paul here is talking about a church that is God's. Now, pastors get together and they will ask questions like, how are things going at your church? Or we'll be out in the community and, we'll ask somebody, how are things going at your church? And you'll talk about my church. And we understand what we're talking about. But we realize that this church is not Pastor Doyle's church. This church is not Roy Squire's church. This church is God's church. It belongs to Him. We are stewards of what He has given to us, but this is God's church. It belongs to Him. Not only does Paul talk about the church being the church of the living God, he also says that it is the house of God. Now, most of the time when Paul uses the term house or household, he's picturing the concept of a family. If you go to chapter 5, verses 1 and 2, Paul says, "Rebuke not an elder, but entreat him as a father, and the younger men as brethren, the elder women as mothers, the younger as sisters with all purity. Honor widows that are widows indeed." And then he goes on to discuss some of the limitations on how you treat widows. He's talking about the household of the church. And that's Paul's usual way of using this concept of house or household, because we are all brothers and sisters. But I think in this context, he may well be looking at more of the idea of a dwelling place. Because he talks about the fact that the church is this house of God, which at the same time is that which belongs to God, and it is the pillar and ground of the truth. So he seems to be using architectural terms here. And he may well be talking then of the idea that the church is a temple. We see that back in 1 Corinthians chapter 3. Now, in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, Paul talks about the temple of the Holy Spirit, and he refers to us as individuals, our bodies being temples of the Holy Spirit. But I think in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, where Paul talks about the temple of God, he's not talking about the individual believer, he's talking about a church. So what Paul's saying here is this local church, Berea Baptist Church, is a house, now not a building. We understand that this structure is not the church. When we all leave tonight, Berea Baptist Church is not here. Okay? Now, I realize we'll sometimes say, hey, I'll meet you at church. You know, maybe on a Tuesday afternoon, a couple guys that are going to do some work, they'll say, okay, I'll meet you at church, and we drive to the building. I don't like a lot about the Church of God, but I do like their signs. Because if you ever look at the sign of a Church of God, it will say something like, the Church of God meets here. So you are the church, not this building. Hurricane could come through and blow this building to smithereens, and as long as we're not in it, the church is undamaged. Now, if we're in it when that happens, then the church may be damaged, but if we're all safe someplace, this building can disappear, and Berea Baptist Church still exists. So it is not this structure which houses, which is the temple of God. It is the church as a body of believers which then houses God's family. So we are this temple which is God's family, brothers, sisters in the Lord. And when Paul refers then to this building, he uses two architectural terms, pillar and ground. When Paul mentions this word pillar in Ephesus, everyone's mind would have been drawn to one of the seven wonders of the world, the Temple of Diana in Ephesus. Temple of Diana was one of the seven wonders of the world at its time. We remember back in the book of Acts when Paul brought the gospel to Ephesus for the first time, there was a riot in the streets. And one of the things that these rioters were crying out for over an hour was, great is the temple of Diana. When Paul came preaching the true God, he was preaching against the false gods, therefore preaching against Diana. And the Ephesus, the people of Ephesus, the Romans and the Greeks there would simply not tolerate that. One of the reasons that the Temple of Diana was one of the seven wonders of the world was because of its pillars. This temple had 127 pillars upholding a massive marble roof. Every single pillar in the Temple of Diana was the gift of a king or an important person. They were all of marble. Some of them were covered in gold. Some of them had jewels inlaid in the marble. And so when you would walk into the Temple of Diana, you would see all of these beautiful pillars. But what were they doing? They were upholding the roof. Now, Ephesus was a sea town. So if you came in by boat, you would pretty much see the city of Ephesus laid out before you. But if you came in on foot, you would walk down the hillside, down toward the sea level city. And as you were coming into the city, you would see in the temple square this massive roof upheld by 127 pillars. And so when Paul says the church, First Baptist Church of Ephesus, applying that to here, Berea Baptist Church, is the pillar and ground of the truth, he's not saying you are the only pillar of the truth. He's saying you are one of many. You don't put a roof on a single post. If you tried to put a roof on a single post, that roof would be going all over the place. So you make sure that you have lots of foundations. I'm looking here and you got, this beam and that beam and that beam. And, you've got a lot of beams here holding up the roof. I'm thankful for that. You should be too. Truth is held up by a multitude of pillars. Down through history, some of these pillars have disappeared. Other pillars have taken their place. But the cumulative effect is that churches that believe the Bible and live according to the Bible are upholding truth. So these people of Ephesus, when Paul says we're the pillar of the truth, they would have immediately thought of this function of pillar. Now, the term pillar doesn't show up very often in the New Testament. It's a pretty rare word. Revelation 10:1, the legs of an angel are said to be like pillars of fire, but that doesn't help us in our understanding of pillar here. In Revelation 3:12, it says faithful believers will become pillars in God's temple. So that's getting a little closer to this concept. Perhaps Galatians 2:9, the third use of the term, is a little closer because here the leaders of the church in Jerusalem are called the pillars. So the idea is that we, as a body of believers, collectively, in this context, uphold truth. The problem with this concept of pillar is that if sufficient numbers of the pillars begin to give way, the roof begins to collapse. If sufficient numbers of churches begin to fail to uphold truth, truth starts getting lost. I enjoy church history. I'm not a historian. But you go back to countries like England, where the truth used to be proclaimed pretty mightily. First missionary was a Baptist from England, William Carey, took the gospel to India. The truth was being upheld and the truth was being sent around the world. I talked this morning about our distance education. Had a student from England, one of my classes, a couple of my classes. He's graduated, I think, a year ago. He's pastoring a fundamental Baptist church in England, and he said, it's pretty lonely over here. There are only a handful of churches like mine. He's kind of up north, and he says there's only a handful of churches, maybe 6 like mine, in the northern half of England. What happened? A church here, a church there, began to drift into liberal theology. And before long, the pillars collapsed, and truth is just about non-existent in many areas of England. We have a Maranatha alumnus who's a missionary to Wales. Wales was the place of the great Welsh revival, and the Welsh revival sent missionaries out into the world. And now you go to Wales and you find those churches that were built, the buildings that were built to house those churches that developed, that sprung up during the Welsh revival, and you see that they're concert halls, they're city museums, they're apartment buildings. The truth was lost. So we have an obligation to uphold the truth. Now, not only are we the pillar of the truth, we are also the ground of the truth. We don't exactly know what that word means. This is the only place it's used, not only in the New Testament, it's the only place it's used in any Greek that we know of until the church fathers who were quoting this verse. So we kind of have to guess at its meaning. So you look at different translations and you see ground, foundation, buttress, support. We aren't exactly sure what it means, but we can get the picture even without knowing exactly what the word refers to. It's the idea that we have got to uphold truth. Now, we here tonight are examples of what one writer has called politically incorrect salvation. We are politically incorrect because we view the diversity in the religious world around us differently than others. If you go to many of the churches in this area and talk to them about religious diversity, they will tell you how wonderful that is. How wonderful it is that there are many paths to God. How people can believe a wide variety of things and still be called and considered Christian. And we don't view diversity that way. We have a different view of diversity because we're politically incorrect. We still believe in absolutes. We still believe there's only one way to heaven. We are accredited by the Higher Learning Commission. It's the organization that accredits the upper Midwest for the most part, and Arizona. Now, they used to call themselves North Central Accreditation because all of their states were in the north central part of the school of the nation, and then they added Arizona to that organization, so they had to change their name because they're not North Central when you got Arizona in there. I don't know how that happened, but it's the way it works. So we go to their meetings, and in the last 2 or 3 years, there has been tremendous pressure on universities adhering to this concept of diversity. University of Wisconsin, University of Madison, University of Illinois, University of Michigan, lots of smaller schools. And the schools have to be diverse. And then there's Maranatha. You have to have a testimony of salvation to get in. You have to maintain a fairly strict code of conduct to stay in. Our faculty have to be independent, fundamental Baptists who agree with our ethos. And that's just not acceptable in the academic world. And so they look at us, kind of sideways. And we say, look, you're saying the universities need diversity. We suggest that you need diversity. And that if all you accredited were schools like the University of Minnesota, University of Wisconsin, University of Illinois, you wouldn't have any diversity. So view us as your diversity. We add something a little different to your accrediting agency. We go to those meetings and people hear about Maranatha and what we're doing there. And it's interesting how many people off the record, kind of outside the meeting room, say, wow, I would love to teach at a place like Maranatha. But officially, they aren't sure about us. And our board decided when we became accredited that we were not going to give up our ethos. We'll give up accreditation first. But we're not going to give up who we are. Because then we would be giving up truth. So you have people today, philosophers, theologians, average person on the street, who argue for the plurality of religious tradition. That openness to different ways to heaven is a good thing. That we should not be so narrow as to say only Christians are going to heaven. Or even more narrow, only people who believe the Bible, because there are Christians who don't believe, Christians using that term generically, who don't believe the Bible. So we have this very narrow view, and people look at us and they say, that's just not with the times. You're not up to speed. You need to change your beliefs. But the problem is this openness to religion of any kind is incompatible with specific truth claims. It just doesn't match up with what the Bible declares. And so it's important for us to realize that there are theologians out there who they're not saying we can't know for certain which road takes us to heaven. That's not what they're saying. What they're saying is that all roads must lead to heaven. No one worldview is true. So we must not simply be tolerant. Baptists have always been tolerant. But we must acknowledge the truthfulness of all paths. The problem is, you have to line truth up with reality, or it's not truth. Some of you would probably rejoice if I made the statement, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers won the 2016 Super Bowl. Isn't that wonderful? There's just one little problem with that statement. It doesn't align with reality. So we would say that statement is not true. Because at this point, we realize that reality and truth should line up. If we're willing to acknowledge truth in that regard, why would we not acknowledge truth that must align with the reality of the text? Why do people want this non-specific religion, or this set of religions that are open to all kinds of approaches to God? Many of these theologians are becoming what are called universalists. A universalist is someone who believes that everybody's going to heaven. The theological liberals believed this back in the late 1800s into the 20th century. They would argue that as long as you're just religious, you're going to heaven. God is this great grandfather in the sky who sits in his rocking chair on the front porch of heaven, strokes his beard, and welcomes all of his grandchildren to heaven no matter what they've done, what they believe, or how they live. And the Bible-believing people rejected that. But today you have people who call themselves evangelicals who say there is no hell. Everybody's going to heaven. Clark Pinnock used to be a solid evangelical believer. I think he's back to that position because he died a few years ago, and so his later theology has now been corrected. But he said, I am appealing to evangelicals to make the shift to a more inclusive outlook. He said, God is going to find faith in people without the people even realizing it. He said, we're not exactly sure how this is going to work. He suggested maybe people are going to be given a second chance after death. There are some people who argue that if someone has never heard the gospel in this lifetime, then they meet Jesus Christ, and he stands there, heaven's on one side, hell's on the other, and he proclaims the gospel to them and says, which would you prefer, heaven or hell? Now, honestly, if that were true, I would say let's just quit talking to anybody about the gospel. Because who's going to be more effective at evangelizing the lost, Jesus or me? There are numbers of evangelicals today who are saying in one way, shape, or form, there is no hell. And honestly, I wish that were true. I would love to be able to say there's no hell. I would feel a whole lot better if that were not the case. But there's one problem. It's like the Bucs winning the 2016 Super Bowl. It doesn't align with reality. Scripture is clear. there is a hell from which we need to see people saved. This declaration that the church is the pillar and ground of the truth includes then the necessity of displaying the truth. It is not sufficient to just keep the truth within the four walls of this building. There's a push in Washington, D.C. to make religious liberty the freedom to do whatever you want, believe whatever you want, as long as you keep it within these four walls. But that's not freedom of religion. Our freedom, our responsibility is to take the truth outside these four walls. It's not sufficient to just have truth here on a Sunday morning or a Sunday night. That truth has to live itself out in our lives outside tomorrow and Tuesday and Wednesday and the rest of the week. Like this roof of the great temple being held up by a series of pillars, we should hold forth the word of life. We do this by means of corporate ministry. What we do on Sunday morning, what we do on Sunday night, what we do on Wednesday, special events that take place inside the church as part of the church ministry. That's one of the ways we uphold the truth. We also uphold it through personal faithfulness. Every one of us have an obligation to uphold the truth. Failure on either part, failure in the individual, failure in the corporate body, results in a loss of truth. And in our culture today, we need truth. People are crying for truth. And they don't know what it is. And they don't know where to find it. What a privilege it is for us as church members and for our churches as fellowships of church members to set forth the truth. And in this context, the truth centers on Jesus, who he is, and what he has done. Through the church, we lift up God's truth. Father, thank you for your